today we're talking about what happens after you put a property under contract. A little bit of background on myself. I used to be the head of transactions for Aimco and asset management for Waterden Residential. Done about $9 billion worth of transactions, a total of like 470 dispositions and about 30 or 40 acquisitions. So know a little bit about this process for once you put a property under contract. Just to kind of go along with the way we've structured this, initially, once you put the property under contract, you're going to get your loan documents and everything lined up for the lender, and they're typically going to require a PCA, which is a property condition assessment. I like to think of that as, it's a home inspection, just on steroids. So you would have a company hired to come in, typically by the lender that they trust, and they require you to have or use their preferred vendor. And they'll look at things like the age of the property, the roofs, foundations, et cetera. So the property condition assessment is fairly detailed, and it goes across the gambit. So you could look at new construction versus a 70s era product, and you're going to have a lot of different items that come up. This report is there to help identify things that you didn't see during your initial investigation of the property before you or while you were underwriting the property. This allows you to find out things about like the roof, foundations, the pump rooms, if it has sprinkler systems. Depending on the age of the property, you would want to get lead testing and asbestos testing. There's also items that would tend to lead to the second area, which is your environmental reports. So again, lenders would require those reports to be done. So you're looking at a phase one, but sometimes lenders are going to be forgiving depending on if it's a greenfield site, new construction, kind of in farmland, or if you're going to be in a brownfield site, which is reclaimed land. Some of the things to consider and look at when you're deciding if you need to get an environmental report is the surrounding areas and the prior use of the property. So if the property was vacant, fallow land that was there for 100 years and just turned from a farm into an apartment building, then the risk is lower. But farmers always have a tendency to bury their oil stuff throughout the property. So you just have to check and make sure that the inspections are including things like a review of whether there's buried oil tanks and things like that. Even in a urban setting, you have to look at what the surrounding uses are. So a lot of the flags are if there was a power station nearby or a dry cleaner nearby. Those are all things that could impact the potential for an environmental risk at the property. These are all things that are typically required by your lender. So the same thing goes for like your title and surveys. You'll get a survey for the property and you need to review it for things like encroachments and easements that are on the property. You don't want to get in a situation where the builder built a property and didn't abide by the setbacks. So then you would have to potentially cure things. So you always want to make sure that you have an attorney review all of the title and survey to identify any potential risks that might pop up with regard to those types of issues. Easements are important because you just want to make sure that there is nothing that will negatively impact your property in the future. So you may have a utility easement running down the middle of the property, which may not be that big of a deal. But if you're in a more, let's say, urban setting, you could have an easement that allows a neighboring property to have access to your site, shared driveways, things like that. Those all have potential impacts on value. So those are the types of things that you want to review as part of your due diligence process. It's always critical to have your attorneys review all the surveys, but the PCA, the property condition assessment report that your typical lenders require, those may go into enormous levels of detail. I mean, they'll find, cracks in the driveway, You just have to make the determination of what the potential risk is with those. So you're looking for the big ticket items that were not part of your initial review. So I always suggest people take as much time reviewing a property during the underwriting process so that a lot of these undisclosed items may not be an issue because you've done your due diligence before you submitted your offer. So you took a lot of those issues into consideration, like, exterior painting. If you look at the property and it's brand new, you don't need to paint it, but you don't need a PCA to tell you that the property has to have a new paint job. So if it's built in the 70s and you look at it and it's faded, and you include that in your underwriting, you don't need an inspector to come in and tell you, hey, the property needs to be painted. But those are kind of the required items that your lender is going to typically ask for as part of the closing process. The next bigger phase is kind of your active due diligence, things like your unit walks, doing your lease reviews. I highly recommend that you walk 100% of the units. The biggest concern for underwriting is you're relying on a offering memorandum and a rent roll that is provided by the seller. And you can review that in detail and everything looks great. But until you start to verify that information to make sure that everything ties together, those assumptions could be invalid. So when you go and do your unit walks, you are really looking for things like confirming occupancy, making sure that when you look at that rent roll and it says that you're at 95% occupancy and you walk 100% of the units, you have only 5% vacant units. You want to also confirm the number of tenants. In certain markets, you could be in a situation where you have a 2-bedroom, 1-bath unit that may have 6, 7, 8 people living in it. Those are things that are going to be a drain on the operation for the property. So you want to be able to include some of that in your forecasting for how much your turn expenses are going to be. Confirming pets is a big thing because typically you would want to include a pet rent. So if you look at your rent roll and it says 30% of your residents have pets and you do your unit walks and it turns out it's 50, there's a upside that you can build into your underwriting right there by charging people the pet rent that they deserve. The other reason that you want to walk 100% of the units is to just do a condition assessment so that you can go through and create a checklist that will have all the key factors of the any damage, carpet condition, age of the appliances, age of the water heaters. So you can start to build a preventative maintenance plan for each, for the property as a whole. This way it'll help you when you can start to forecast out your future capital needs of, hey, the average age of water heaters is X. So we should build into our underwriting, assuming we're going to have to replace 5 to 6 water heaters a year. By doing that due diligence up front, you will be less likely to have surprises that happen down the road after you have owned the property for a little bit. That kind of goes hand in hand with the lease reviews. It is critically important to have somebody review the leases to compare the numbers in the rent roll with the numbers that are in the actual lease document. Rent rolls are typically a data entry nightmare. So people are human, they make mistakes. So there's typos that happen all the time. So you want to compare in-place rent versus actual rent on the leases, the security deposits, any other fees associated with the property. So it's really important that you spend time reviewing all of those documents to make sure that you are on the same page with your underwriting. Because you can make all the assumptions in the world, but if the baseline data that you're basing your assumptions on are in error, then you may have to tweak this. So one of the things that I have, and I may just let me try to share my screen real quick. I'm going to kind of walk you through a due diligence checklist that I have. Oops, this is not the right one. Pardon me. Melissa, are you seeing our due diligence checklist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So I am going to turn that one on. There we go. So basically what I have here is a detailed checklist that I go through for every one of our properties when we buy or sell. Is we want to make sure who's assigned for the property for each task, doing lease reviews, contract reviews, which just an FYI, this is really critical because if you made assumptions of saying, hey, I'm going to put in a new vendor for cable and wireless, you have to review the contracts to ensure that there's no lockouts or restrictions to those. So this is a very, very detailed list of everything that we would go through as part of our process so that we can look at all the critical items to make sure that we are checking every box so that you don't miss anything. So like this is just the generic of every task that's there. So we also want to make sure we look at what the sellers are delivering to us. So did we get their capital budgets? Do we have their security deposit reports? Do we have their delinquency reports, their occupancy, any criminal activity reports, insurance claims? So basically this allows us to go through in detail and review all of the items that you don't miss an opportunity or miss something as you're going through the acquisition process, because this is your time to raise flags and identify potential issues that may come up. So there are lots of different things that stop sharing now. Oops. There it is. Stop share. Okay. So there's lots of items that you can include in your checklist. Mine's very, very detailed because, we're dealing with, I built this when I was overseeing hundreds of properties. So that is something that is important to use that you can be sure that you aren't missing anything or nothing's falling through the cracks. Typically, if you're using a management company, you would have them do a lot of this work for you. If you're self-managed, again, it depends on the size and scale of the property. If it's a 12-unit property that you're buying, yeah, it's really easy to do the unit walks and the lease reviews because it's there. If you're buying a 300-unit property, you're going to need a team of people to sit down and review all of those leases and ensure that everything is checked off. At this point, I'm trying to see if it makes sense to go through because I see a lot of questions coming up. So let me see what we have here. Will the lender order a PCA in environmental, or do we do? It depends on the lender. If it's a larger property, the lender will require it and they'll give you a list of preferred vendors, and then you're going to have to include that as part of the due diligence, your due diligence expenses. Typically, it's best to use the lender's preferred vendors because then you don't have any issues of do they trust the report, and is that something that you don't want to have to educate the lender. You'd rather use their preferred vendors. But depending on the size and scale, if you have people that you would like to use, yes, it's something that you can work through. What would you suggest for due diligence for century-old buildings? Well, that's a little bit difficult because the title review process goes back 100 years. It's really important to have a inspector come in and look at things such as the boiler, lead-based paint, galvanized versus copper pipes, those types of issues that for old buildings will come back and be an issue. The reality is buildings that were built 100 years ago were built solid. So there may or may not be an issue. I personally have experience with a building built in 1915, and yes, it had galvanized pipe throughout, but it was still solid. So you just have to keep an eye on it and make sure that, there are no leaks. Do you provide these detailed checklists to investors? I put together the due diligence for the properties and try to dig through everything and give it to Dan and Danny and Brandon and let them make the decisions as to what the risks are. So I don't know if you share those with the investors. I think what happens is we put together the investment package and share all of the upsides, pluses and minuses, and have it well thought out. But that may be a question for next week with Brandon when he comes back to do the retrade side of the issue, which is when do you actually make the decision of, is this an issue that we have to actually go back and say, hey, this is going to cost us money, so we need to retrade or get something back. All of this due diligence is there to help identify whether or not all of your assumptions were correct. And typically when you underwrite, you're making assumptions as to how much initial capital you're going to have to put into the property. And when you do this due diligence, you're confirming, hey, my numbers seem right. Cost of the PCA. That really depends on the size of the property, your vendor, your bank. It can be as cheap as $1,200 or it could be as expensive as $5,000. It really depends on how detailed you're going to get and whether or not your PCA provider also does the environmental work. A lot of times, if you're buying a property that already has an older phase one, you can just get an update of the phase one report from preferably the same vendor, because he just goes back and checks to see if anything has changed from when they did the original report. The same goes for surveys. If there was an existing survey done of the property, you can just get an updated survey and it will hopefully allow you to, save some money there, because updating a survey just checks to see what changes were done, if there's any new construction, if you added a building or expanded a building and it potentially impacts the site. That's why you would do that. Let's see here. The checklist. Again, the checklist that I have is very detailed because it was built for institutional property investment. So if you're buying a 8 to 12 unit property, typically you're not going to have a lot of things like service contracts and laundry contracts, internet service, things like that. So you would have a much more pared down review. Typically for an 8 to 12 unit property, a lot of investors utilize just home inspectors to do the work because they can do radon testing. And unless your lender requires it, you may not have to do an environmental survey for the property. So again, for smaller investors, you treat the inspection very, very similar to a home inspection, where they can come in, check to make sure everything is working. And when you have 8 to 12 units, you can get it done in a couple hours. So it's really not that complicated. What reports do you check in order to verify whether the property has short-term rental conditions? Those reports are typically part of the rent roll. So you would need to look at the leases, and most institutional properties have restrictions in the lease language itself against things like Airbnb and short-term rental for people. So as part of your lease review, if you're buying a property that is professionally managed and all the leases are the same, you do a detailed review of a single lease so that you know what all the terms are and what's standard. And then you do a quick review of all the subsequent leases to identify any differences that may have occurred if somebody, changed the term or crossed something out. But typically when you look at all the leases, you're looking for all the financial terms, expiration dates, security deposits, rents, pets, number of tenants, things like that. Let's see. Let me see what else we have question-wise. Series, would you talk some ways to get equity out of the commercial loan multi-units? Not exactly sure what that question is. If you're talking about a mixed-use property, the due diligence is a little bit different. If you have retail as part of your property, the lease review for retail is totally different than what you would do for residential lease reviews. You would need to do a detailed scope of what are their lease terms, the renewal rates, any tenant improvement dollars that you have in there. If a broker was involved, you would typically have a potential to pay a leasing commission upon renewal. There are a lot of restrictions with regard to leases. So if you sign a lease with, let's say, Jimmy John's, the sub company, they will put a caveat in their lease that says you cannot rent to another sandwich shop or coffee shop or things like that that would compete with their business. So as you do your due diligence and you have a mixed use property, you would want to make sure you take a look at those aspects of the lease in detail. Typically, you can get a lease abstract, which has all the key terms. But a lot of times, if it's a small property that only has 5 or 6 retail tenants, which is typical of multifamily, you would have to do a detailed lease review of all 6 of those leases. Also, the valuation impact of retail on multifamily is viewed a little bit differently because they are longer term leases and things like that. So you want to make sure you check all the boxes with regard to your lease review. State specific issues. I have done transactions in almost all 50 states and have used the same process across the board. There are some specifics that you would have to deal with regard to lease term language, evictions, things like that. But for the most part, it's pretty much the same process. Some communities may have a different environmental review process that the lender would require, but that's going to be a lender-driven issue more so than anything from the municipalities that you would be dealing with. Are there any more questions? I will check with Dan, and if we can get the due diligence checklist sent out to everybody, we will. It is a kind of proprietary that we put together for this our investment group, and it's also really detailed. So if it's it may be a lot of overkill if you're buying less than 20 unit properties. Typically would be applicable to something that's more 50 to institutional grade, as large as you want. Because again, in my background, we purchased properties as small as 50 and sold properties as large as 2,000 units. So it was helpful to have a system in place that you can use the same process, so you can just go through and kind of check the boxes to make sure that everything was done as you're doing your due diligence. Because due diligence is the only time that you can raise questions and challenge any of the assumptions that were made as part of your acquisition. We have another question. Would you suggest having full competitive analysis for rentals before closing the deal? I would suggest you do a full competitive rental analysis before you even put the offer in. You want to make sure you understand what the rents are, and what you're trying to do is validate the assumptions you make for your underwriting as part of your due diligence. So if you are looking at a property and you think the rents are, $1.20 a square foot, and that's great for the market, you should be looking at your comps and the other properties in the area to ensure that that assumption is right. The other thing is, if you're doing any kind of value add, you also want to make sure you're not just looking at the way your property is compared to today and the existing condition, but where it will be in the future post renovation. And that's part of the reason to do 100% of the unit walks, because you may be assuming, let's say, a $5,000 moderate per unit renovation. But as you do your unit walks, if you realize that this is an older property and has, let's say, a longer term tenant base that have been residents for, let's say, on average of 3 years, that's a lot of wear and tear on the property. So if you are making an assumption of a $5,000 per unit turn, and you go through the property and realize that the condition of the units are, let's say, subpar, you may have to tweak your underwriting to adjust for that increased repair and maintenance to get those units to the level that they need to be just to start the renovation. So that's why you spend a lot of time and effort doing the unit walks, so you have a good idea of the existing condition, because your underwriting may still be sound, but you may only underwrite, let's say, 90% of the units instead of 100, because you're going to have to move some money around to cover additional repair and maintenance costs. All right. We got about 15 minutes more. Any other questions? Let's see. I don't see anything else. Yeah, because I know next week Brandon's going to talk about retrades. So that is something that should be done rarely, but effectively. I'm just going to leave it at that, because you don't want to get a reputation as a buyer who goes in with a high price and then comes in at due diligence and retrades all the time. You want to do all of your initial work up front to ensure that your numbers are as solid as you can when you put a property under contract. Build into that underwriting as much room as you can for unknowns based upon your initial walkthrough, and then only adjust for things that are undisclosed. So if there is foundation issues that you found, or the boiler is older than they thought and is currently leaking, that's something that you don't typically do on a normal walk through. So we have a few more questions. Covered lease audits. We did, and I'll just give a quick overview for people that join late. Lease audits, basically that's just going through each lease and comparing the basics of the terms for rent rate, security deposits, pets, number of tenants, and then you use that rent roll and review to compare against the unit walks and what you find physically when you're there. So they kind of go hand in hand. It's asked for physical unit walks, assuming after. Well, you can do your unit walks. You would need to get an access agreement if you don't have a contract. So if you have a tight due diligence time frame and they've accepted your LOI and you would like to start to do some preliminary due diligence, you can get what they call an access agreement that will allow you to get onto the property to start to do some of your physical due diligence early before the contract starts. Typically, they're going to want to have your escrow deposit in place before you do that, because there is the risk of potential causing damage. I know in my past life, we had sold a property and someone had their roof inspection being done and the guy fell through the roof. So you want to make sure you have some liability coverage in case something like that happens. So those are just things to keep in mind. What if all the leases are expired in month to month? Typically that is normal for smaller investment properties. You want to look at the length of occupancy that those tenants have had. So if you're buying an 8-unit property and everybody has lived there for 6 years and they're all month to month, A, it gives you flexibility to increase rents, and B, it gives you the opportunity to convert everybody to your standard lease. And C, if you're planning on doing a full renovation upgrade, it's easier to get those people out and then do all of your renovations at once and then re-tenant it. So there's some risks associated with it, but you have to look at if the length of occupancy is the critical factor. If people are just signing month-to-month leases that are brand new, that would be a red flag. What if a significant portion of your tenants are on government subsidies? Well, I mean, there's good and bad with government subsidies. One is the condition of the units and how they maintain it. And the plus side is guaranteed revenue. So again, looking at investment properties, you have to weigh the balance of the condition of the property, how well people maintain it. Typically in a lease, even with government subsidized, the residents still have a maintenance clause in their lease to maintain a clean living environment. So you just have to make sure that there are no other restrictions on a lease with subsidies. So if it's a voucher where it's basically just the resident is a tenant and you are accepting a Section 8 voucher or a HUD batch voucher, you can operate it just like a normal property. Other affordable housing that have a LURA or a land use restriction agreement, there's a lot more reporting requirements as part of those. So that is something you want to investigate as part of due diligence. That will show up on the title report, which is one of the reasons why you want to do a thorough title review. Do you always do a sewer inspection for older properties? I would say that kind of depends on the age of the property and based upon discussions with the residents as you're doing your inspections. If there's issues with the property where you have plumbing issues that have been known, I think it's something, depending on the age of the property, if it's over 50 years old, yeah, it probably is worth the money to spend to get the sewers snaked out or inspected. The buyer environmental survey questionnaire versus the survey, there's really not much of a difference. One is typically sent to the buyer from the environmental inspection company, and the other one is provided as kind of like a buyer knowledge or seller knowledge of the property. So they'll ask as part of like a disclosure document, do you know of lead-based paint or do you know of asbestos at the property? So I would say they're about the same, but depending on the type of property that you have or the size, again, if you're a small multifamily investor dealing with, under 50 units, this is going to be something you're going to do kind of on your own because lenders may not require a full phase 1 study done. And typically on larger institutional deals, the sellers aren't going to fill out any kind of property condition report before sale. They're going to use that where is, as is clause and live and die with that. So you have to do your due diligence to do the inspections. All right, we're almost done here. Would you recommend month-to-month versus 1-year leases for new purchases? That's an investment theory, more so than due diligence, but it depends on what your plan is. If you have plans to remodel, then yes, keep people month to month, and then you have the flexibility to get them out. If you are looking for long-term investments and you want to get everybody onto a standardized lease form that you are comfortable with, then yeah, you kind of require or ask everyone to sign a new lease. You can't force people to sign new leases, but you can, upon renewal, change the lease form and renew them for a year. It's really a specific investment decision on whether you want to do month-to-month or year-long leases. All right. Well, I think that's it. Unless anybody else has any more questions, I think we could possibly wrap this up. I believe Brandon will be back next week, and hopefully he can kind of go through the remaining question of retrades and whatnot. Thank you all for joining, and you guys have a great day.